All right, hello everyone. It is 4 o'clock, and so we're going to go ahead and get started. It is my absolute pleasure today to welcome Randall Munroe. I'm sure the vast majority of you know that Randall Munroe is the author of 3 #1 New York Times best-selling books. What If? Serious Scientific Answers to Absurd Hypothetical Questions. Thing Explainer, Complicated Stuff in Simple Words. How To, Absurd Scientific Advice for Common Real-World Problems, as well as the popular webcomic XKCD. As a former NASA roboticist, he excels at explaining complex ideas in simple and hilarious ways. His comics and charts have been featured in publications such as The Guardian, The New York Times, and Science. And now, Overthinking Things with Randall Munroe: Science, Comics, and the Benefits of Ridiculous Questions.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. It's really great to see you. And this is a great crowd. So it's always a little bit funny when if I'm going to do a talk or get introduced or something, or I have to write out a little one-line bio or resume or whatever, because people always mention that I worked at NASA, which is very, it was really cool. It always sounds more impressive than it really was, I feel like. Because people will usually, oh, you worked at NASA, like, maybe you're not an astronaut, you worked on robots. Okay, so you worked on the Curiosity rover or one of the ones that landed on Mars? And I was like, no, because the people who worked on those were the really cool NASA roboticists. I was in a couple tiers down from that. I was working on a demonstration robot. And so my job was we had a robot that was not going to go to another planet. It was not really going to go anywhere except the office in which we were working on it, like around the floor of the lab. And its job was to demonstrate cool sensors. So if someone had built a nice X-ray fluoroscope or ultrasonic sensor or whatever, and they wanted to show it off to NASA higher-ups, try to get it funded, and they would put it on our robot, which could drive around and show how it works and show how cool it was, and then ideally they would succeed in convincing someone to put it on an important robot, which meant that what they were telling me to do was kind of open-ended, because it was really just drive around and try not to crash into any NASA administrators, which I was okay at. It usually didn't. So when people bring it up and talk about how, oh, I used to work at NASA, it's always interesting seeing how they describe why I no longer work at NASA, because sometimes they'll say, in 2006 he quit NASA to draw comics full-time on the internet. And then sometimes if they'll put a hedge a little bit more and say, when his contract ran out in 2006, he began drawing comics on the internet full-time. And then sometimes they're like, after NASA fired him, and the truth is a little ambiguous. But I did want to clear this up a little. I had a wonderful time working there, and I was working on a contract basis. So every 90 days, my contract to do navigation, some hardware work on this robot was renewed. And then at some point, they decided not to renew the contract again. But they were really nice about it. Everyone I worked with was really nice. And they didn't really say, well, we don't, that we have a problem with your work or whatever. They were like, we can hook you up with another contract in the building. There are all these different labs working on all these different things. And it was just at the same time that I had started drawing comics, and people had started visiting them and wanted to order T-shirts and stuff. And I realized I could maybe make a living for a little while doing this. So I said, okay, thank you. I'll get back in touch with you about doing another, maybe doing another contract. And then the comics took off, I guess, and I never did. But so it is ambiguous exactly whether they decided not to renew my contract or I decided to quit. But when I was working there, I was, like I said, I was okay at it. Like I was developing, the main thing that I built was this wander algorithm that you could put the robot down into any open space, and it would use these ultrasonic sensors to look around and try to find open areas to explore in. And it was cool. It didn't involve any kind of mapping. It was just a complete stateless, like this system where it didn't have any memory. It didn't have a map of the area. It was just navigating based on what it could see at this moment. But I got it to work pretty well. It made it, explore and look like it was, and it would feel out areas and try to find open spaces. The robot that we were working on was about the size of R2-D2. Like it was, kind of yay high, and shaped kind of like a pear with like a stalk and then a big head on top. And it had these weirdly powerful wheels. It had a really interesting drive system that was this. It's like a mechanism wheel system, which means it can roll in any direction and it can spin. It has a whole bunch of axes of motion, and it used 3 of them, which is maybe the first one I've heard of that did that. It was, my boss there worked on that. And so, but I noticed that because we were kind of demonstrating this cool drive system, it was a lot more powerful than it needed to be to just get around an office. So in that summer of 2006, there was one afternoon when I was the only person in the lab. And I noticed, because I was working on this navigation system, which is constantly hooking up a laptop to it, being like, okay, start moving this way. Whoa, it went too fast because I've messed something up somewhere. And I realized it could really pull pretty hard, and it could totally pull me off my feet. Also, it could have probably seriously injured a NASA administrator. But what I realized was, first of all, I had this robot that's like, wow, this thing can really pull. And also, our office, the lab, had those rolling office chairs with the little wheels. And it was one of those, it was like a 1960s building. This was NASA Langley Research Center. And so it was these big Apollo-era buildings where it was like just a single tile floor that went through the whole building. And my lab was just one off of this corridor, one of those big square corridors with many other labs all around it. So I'm sitting there and I realize that this robot can pull really hard, and we have these rolling office chairs. So I got a length of Cat5 cable. The robot connection was wireless, but I got the Cat5 cable and I tied like a bowline, and then looped it over the robot's head like a lasso, and then I got into the rolling chair with the laptop that was controlling the robot. And held onto the other end of the Cat5 cable and wrapped it around my hand. And then with the other hand on the laptop, I activated this wander mode that I had been working on. And the robot took off and yanked me behind it, rolling like a chariot. And it went across the lab, saw the benches and the tables on the other side, was like, whoops, don't want to go over there, turned, and I swung around behind it on the chair, it had more than enough power to pull me around. And so I did a few circuits of the lab this way, and eventually, after it had gone around a couple of times, as it was supposed to, it found the open door where there was an even larger space to explore. So it took off out into the hallway with me kind of banging into the walls as I hang on behind. And it turned and was like, hey, look, this is such an open space, can't even see a wall. I'm going to take off down in that direction and explore. And it took off down the hallway. And it towed me behind it, barely noticing the weight, and it would now and then drift to a wall and be like, oops, there's a wall there, and veer away, and I'd swing and bonk into the wall a little bit, but I didn't intervene at all, and it's something that's really fun when you've made something and taught it to do something, and then you let it go and watch it as it executes your plan, and you're you're really proud and you don't want to intervene. You're like, is it going to do it on its own? And so I was just hanging on behind this, and it towed, and I was extremely proud because it got all the way down to the corner of the hallway and went around the corner, and then took off down the far short leg of the rectangle, and then around the other side of the building, which I realized until this day I had never been to. And it turns out there are a bunch of other labs over there too. And so I got to very briefly meet these other NASA researchers as I zipped past their doorway And so I would just like go by and see someone's at a desk and just like, oh, hi, I'm Randall. I work at the lab on the other side of the, okay. Oh, hey, I'm Randall. I'm in the robot. Hi, robot. But I was very proud of myself and very proud of the robot because it did what I assume is the first complete circumnavigation of that one building at NASA Langley Research Center, made it all the way around and back to the lab where I started, where I finally deactivated it, having successfully circumnavigated the building. So I don't know why they didn't want to renew my contract. But it worked out okay because I had started doing comics online. I had done a physics degree in college, worked on these robots, but then I went into doing comics, and a lot of the time I would do comics about, interesting science topics. But it was interesting how doing comics and doing science were kind of similar. Like what I find really appealing about both of them is that you get to take an idea and just kind of run with it, even if it seems like it probably wouldn't work, and like figure out what would happen. And that's what's fun to me. Like I like doing physics because it's very theoretical. It gives you all these very high-level tools for understanding the world in very abstract terms, where everything is a frictionless vacuum, or you can make all these simplifying assumptions. But it's still connected to the real world. You can ask very straightforward questions, about real things and get answers. And I really like that because I have all kinds of really silly questions that I want to feel kind of too embarrassed to ask, but I like sitting there and figuring out the answer, and that that science gives me these tools to figure out the answers to these questions without having to go and ask someone else and reveal that I was wondering this ridiculous thing like, if you connect a straw from Europa to Earth, could you siphon all the water from one to the other? But so and with comics, this is sort of, I feel like there's some of the same appeal there for me. I had actually, I noticed that there's a giant ball pit here. One of my first comics I did was, I had this idea that, hey, it would be really cool to fill your apartment with those McDonald's, ball pit balls. And I thought this idea was not gonna, I thought about it and I was like, oh, this is a cool idea, I want to do this. And then I started thinking about it more and I'm like, okay, well, wait, there are a lot of practical problems you'd run into. You'd need some kind of an airlock system for the front door, but that's probably doable. But then what about the kitchen? What if you drop food? How would you deal with the bathroom? How would you clean them? What if, you spill drinks? It seemed like there were just too many engineering problems to solve. But I could just say, okay, well, let's assume you solve all those, what would it look like? And I can draw a comic about it and explore the idea and find out, And so when I did a comic, I did a comic about someone who did this. And then I got a text message from someone, or this was 2007, so it was an AOL Instant Messenger IM, saying hey, I saw your comic about how you filled your apartment with ball pit balls, and I thought that was a cool idea, so I did it too. Check it out. And this guy showed me the pictures, and something had occurred to him which had not occurred to me, which is you don't have to do the entire apartment. You can just pick the least problematic area and fence it off and build a ball pit there. And so I immediately replied with wait, okay, who's your supplier? How did you do this? And he gave me all these good tips. I learned fun, stuff like there are the surprising engineering problems that you'll run into, even though the balls themselves don't weigh very much, when you jump in, your weight is transmitted in all directions to the walls that are containing it. So you can't just put up a baby gate, which is what I had figured you could do in my comic. You need something that's sturdy enough to handle a person's weight if it, your fence has to be able to hold a person's weight if you have it stretched over a gap. It needs to be really sturdy. But so this was the first year that I had been selling T-shirts and had a profit, and which I probably should have put into savings or something. But instead, I called up this company in Florida. So I placed an order on their website because they sold the playpen balls in batches of 100 and 500, which is good if you're like making a little kid's, like little sandbox. But we had done the math. There was actually someone else who did a calculator online that would tell you how many you needed to fill a given volume. And so we worked out that like we had a big living room main area, and we fenced off half of it. So I went to their website and was like, okay, well they have batches of 100 and 500. We need 10,000. All right, I'm just going to order, 20 of these batches of 500. And then, the shipping calculator didn't charge me for shipping, which I thought was a little bit odd, but I was like, okay, that's, and so about an hour later, my phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was this very nice woman who introduced herself and said, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm calling from Tinker Tots in Florida. Did you just place an extremely large order with us? And I was like, yeah, I'm sorry. I know that you probably don't have that to fill. It's okay. We can, you can, I understand that's kind of, she was like, no, there's no problem. This is great. We would love to fill your order. We just needed to call you to arrange shipping. Because it turns out there's no way to make those balls smaller during transit. Like, they are the size that they are. They take up that certain amount of volume. Like, the volume that they take up in your living room, they're going to take up everywhere they are. It's a really interesting geometry problem to figure out, like, what is the maximum packing densities you can get in unordered balls, and it's like 64%, I think, is about your limit, but in practice it might be higher than that depending on gravity and friction and a bunch of other fun physics things. And also there are a whole bunch of like unsolved problems in that kind of geometry, which is always fun. That's one of my favorite things about physics is how many very simple problems turn out to be like unsolved. Because in physics you always learn about like the people searching for the Higgs boson and gravitational waves, and it's these big projects that involve like hundreds of thousands of people trying to find this particle, which is like very important, but also like it's important in a very abstract, fundamental way, like underpinning these theories. And I thought that was cool when I started out doing physics, but like then I learned like we don't know why thunderstorms have lightning in them. And that sounds like a joke, but like, if you look this up, the explanations you'll find will be like, oh, well, so there's the rapidly rising updrafts in the thunderstorms, which are produced by these processes we understand, create a charge separation between the upper and lower parts of the cloud. And that charge separation builds up high enough that eventually it reaches the dielectric breakdown of the air, and you get lightning jumping from the cloud to the ground, or occasionally from the top of the cloud to the ground, or between the parts of the cloud. But you're like, okay, wait, rising air causes a charge separation. Why does that happen? And I've seen some people will explain it, with like, well, it's similar to how when you rub a balloon on your hair, you get a static electricity building up as electrons are transferred, between the hair and the balloon. But if you ask them why that happens, we don't know that either. Just some materials, when rubbed up against some other materials, electrons move from one to the other, but we don't have a good coherent theory of like why. And so, like, lightning, it maybe has something to do with the rain, with the droplets of water, because it seems to happen more when there's water or ice in the cloud. But like, we don't know why lightning happens. Ditto for like, there's no overall theory of how sand flows in an hourglass. Like, if you have an hourglass and sand particles of a certain shape, there's no there's no way to calculate how quickly the sand will flow. It's basically you just have to do it experimentally and find out. Sort of related to the ball pit question. And like why we've recently made headway on the question of why ice skates work. Like, why is ice slippery? So I really like that there are all these questions that sound like, oh, I don't want to admit that I don't know that. And then it turns out science itself doesn't know it. Which is really exciting to me because like there's all this stuff out there to try to figure out, and it's okay if I don't know it. I can because apparently other people don't know it either. And so that idea of like taking a scenario and being like, so what would happen if I tried this? What if I filled my apartment with playpen balls? What if I put a lasso on this robot? Will it be able to pull me? I feel like I'm always coming up with those ideas, and it's sort of 50-50 whether I'm like, this will make a good topic for a comic, or like, I want to sit down and do a bunch of scientific work to find out, will this work or not, because it might work. And so what I've gotten to do with my comics and also with my books is and with these kind of research projects I do is explore some of these ideas. So especially whenever I have a task that's like really repetitive or in some way like labor intensive or boring or annoying or too repetitive, I'm always thinking like, is there a way I could make this work better somehow? Is there a way I could maybe automate this process or replace a whole bunch of like individual steps that are individually easy but take a lot of work, replace these hundreds of steps with one extremely hard step that will end up taking much longer than the original task would have. But once I'm done with that, then I'll have the whole problem solved and I don't have to do the repetitive part. So like, for example, moving is a huge hassle. And so in my latest book, I talked about other approaches you might take to moving, like packing up all your stuff. So moving is a huge hassle, and it involves a lot of labor-intensive, repetitive steps. Like starting with, you just have to pack up all your stuff. So let's see, I have like a whole bunch of stuff that I don't even know what some of it is. Like I have cables for every device I've ever bought. I don't know which one is which because they're never like clearly labeled or anything. The connectors it's like, oh, this is some weird proprietary standard. This goes to something I had at one point owned and may still own. But I don't want to throw it away until I can definitively figure out that, yes, this is connected to the Game Boy Color that I had in 1997, and I don't need it anymore. The Game Boy Color did not have a charging cable, I think, but it did have a camera attachment cable. I do like way too many comics about cable connector standards. But so you have to pack up all this stuff, and you have to put it all into boxes. So you start off like, oh, I'm going to put this in an organized way, and then eventually you're just like shoveling everything you own into unmarked boxes. And then you have to carry all those boxes outside your house, and then you have to get those to the place that you're moving to, which involves having to like then go and probably rent a van or something and load them into the van or get someone to do that for you, which means negotiating with someone on the phone and figuring out how much it will cost and getting estimates. And it's like this huge hassle. So as I'm doing this, I'm always thinking like, is there a better way I could do this? Or is there another way I could do this? I don't know if it's going to be better or not, but it's something to think about. So I think like, okay, I need to get these to the destination. I've already got a car. Could I just kind of push them? And that, like, no, that's not a good idea. But it's fun to draw, so you can just show. And then you're like, oh, wait, hey, this is a pickup truck. It's got a space in the back. You can load stuff into it. But then the pickup truck's going to have to make a whole bunch of trips. And so at some point I started thinking, hey, wait a minute. Why am I putting all of my stuff into boxes? Because all of this stuff is already in a large box-like structure. Can't I just take the house to where I'm moving to and then like either unload the stuff, either like maybe just if I don't want the house that's there already, just put my house in its place, or carry all the stuff out of it and just directly into the new house without having to involve a lot of complicated packing, or maybe like cut open the side of the house and just tip it over to pour things out, which obviously won't work because there are interior walls. So what you got to do is you got to cut holes in the interior walls to make it like one of those marble games where you tip, so you tip the house around and get all the stuff to fall out, and then you have to like, oh, tip it this way so the TV falls down here, and then tip it this way so it comes out. Oh, and then you've got the upper floor, so you have to cut a hole in the floor. At this point, it's definitely just procrastinating to avoid packing. But like, so that part obviously is not going to work. There's no, like that's not a good idea. But I know people do move houses because you'll see it on the highway sometimes. You'll see a truck with a big like wide load sticker and a house sitting on the back, and they're driving it from one place to another. So I look into like, well, okay, how do you even pick up a house? And what I learned is that you can't actually, houses aren't as rigid as like a smaller object made of similar materials would be. Contractors sometimes describe lifting a house as like lifting a king-size mattress, where if you try to lift it from just one edge, like I drew here, just that edge will come up. So if you really want to lift a house and put it on a car, you have to put like girders underneath it that'll support its weight along the whole thing, and you have this structure under it that's like this cradle, and then you can lift that. But then once you do that, you can place it on a car. You can place it on the back of a flatbed truck, like you would any other large heavy object, and drive it to your destination. But then I learned that so I'm researching like, oh, how does that even work? Like, I guess you do want to look for bridges, right? Make sure you can get to your destination. And I was talking to a friend of mine who used to work in a permitting office where they handled issuing the wide load permits for people who wanted to move. And in her particular state, in their at the time that she worked there, she said the thing that most people don't know about moving is that you need to get a wide load permit for every town or jurisdiction that you're going to pass through on the way there. And so people would have this whole plan to move and then not know that they had to apply for 20 different permits because they had to pass through 20 different towns on their way to their destination. And she said it was a huge hassle, and it's what their office spent a lot of their time dealing with. And you definitely don't want to get caught driving without the wide load permit and pulled over. Although that does raise some really interesting questions. Because if you are pulled over for driving recklessly or doing something suspicious, the Fourth Amendment protects you from search and seizure, and the Supreme Court has consistently found that there is a vehicle exception where if they want to come and search your house, they have to, police will have to get a warrant unless they have these extreme circumstances. Whereas with a vehicle, the probable cause requirement is much less, which is, and I love these research deep dives because then I get into this question wait a minute, if you're with your house here, which set of rules applies? Can you require them to go and get a warrant the way you would because it's your house? And so I start reading into this, and it turns out this has gone all the way to at least there was a court case, California v. Carney, I think, over a mobile home where the police wanted to search it for drug paraphernalia or something, and the question was whether they should have been allowed to treat it like a vehicle or not. And the court really this case has gone back and forth. There have been a few subsequent cases that say it's not exactly clear where to draw that line, but generally they conclude that it's the capacity to be quickly moved that is the reason that vehicles are able to be searched more easily than houses. Because with a house, if you need to go get a warrant, the house is probably still going to be there, but a mobile home or a trailer or a car could just leave the scene. And so probably in this situation, you wouldn't be able to claim your Third Amendment right, or your Fourth Amendment rights were being violated because you were basically in a vehicle. Although, as far as I can tell, no court case has ever hinged on a police search of a house that's being transported on the back of a flatbed truck. So, if anyone here wants to be the test case for that, I'll totally give you a shout out in the next edition of my book, and maybe get people to write you letters wherever it is that you're imprisoned after taking my advice. So maybe I am definitely not a lawyer. In fact, so then what I started wondering was, okay, if you're pulled over by a state trooper, there's only one or two court cases that hinge on the Third Amendment, which is against having to quarter troops in your home, saying that you can't be required to quarter troops in your home. And I was then asking my constitutional lawyer friend, okay, could I apply the Third Amendment here? And at that point, he stopped returning my calls. But so then I'm thinking, okay, well, you've got all these jurisdiction problems. You've got to apply for all these permits. This is a really boring and repetitive task. I wonder if there's... So then I realized the towns will have jurisdiction over the roads in the towns and the local roads and stuff. But that only extends for surface vehicles. If you go up 500 feet, then you're in under the jurisdiction of the FAA. And that's probably only one permit you need to apply for. So I had this idea of you get a one of those military heavy lift helicopters, and you just have it lift up the house, lift it up above the jurisdiction of all these towns and police officers who want to violate your Fourth and maybe Third Amendment rights. And no, wide load permits required. You just deal with the FAA however you do that, and then fly to your destination. But then I ran into a problem, which is the largest heavy lift helicopters are not powerful enough to lift a typical suburban American home. They have not even maybe half the lifting capacity for this sort of house that I grew up in. And there are a couple of big, heavy lift airplane type transports, which the loading bays are not quite wide enough to fit. Again, I use the house I grew up in, a fairly close to a median ranch house. And so I was like, okay, it looks like getting your house to hover into the air is going to be difficult. But then I realized, wait a minute, if a helicopter can lift like half the weight of the house, then all you need is 2 helicopters, right? Maybe like a third or a fourth, because you don't want to be unsafe. And then I figured you could just have them all kind of pull. They need to pull in different directions, so you got to fly very carefully to avoid colliding. But and you'd lose a little bit of efficiency. That's why you need to add more helicopters, because you've got the, the weight. They're pulling against each other. When you add up the vectors, you don't get quite 4 times the lifting capacity with this setup. So you got to correct for that stuff. It's very important to be realistic. But then I realized you can actually avoid both of those problems, the helicopter collision and the problems of the inefficiency of pulling in different directions, by just rigidly attaching the helicopters together. And at this point, once again, I start feeling like, okay, I'm definitely just procrastinating because I don't want to load stuff into boxes. But I think my favorite thing about doing this kind of research is that a lot of the time when I come up with, I'm like, okay, this idea is so out there that it is I can no longer even argue with a straight face that that this is something to seriously consider. Often I will discover that not only am I not the first person to have had this idea, but other people have tried to execute it. So in the 1970s, a helicopter manufacturer put together a study for the US Navy on the multi-helicopter heavy lift system. And their idea was, if you take 2 helicopters and you stick them together, it could lift twice as much. And they actually, this is like 150 or 100, it's a 100-something page report where they go over exactly how you'd take 2 helicopters, cut the tail off one, attach them together with a truss, and then you'd have this single vehicle that can lift twice as much. In fact, potentially even more than twice as much, because you've gotten to lose the weight of some of the equipment on the tail. So if the truss is lightweight enough, you might even be able to lift 2.1 times as much. And they went through every detail of and these are old 1970s scanned blueprints that are now available online. There's so many cool, weird government studies online like this. But they went through all the details of it, and they worked out all these practical problems. And it sort of felt like my friend with the ball pit, where you can actually solve each of these problems, and then you get something that might actually work. In this case, the Navy did not decide to fund their study, possibly because the 2 helicopters linked together, it looks a lot like, I thought, when you go to a marsh or something and you see the dragonflies flying around, they'll during their mating ritual or whatever, they'll hook one tail to head. And it looked a lot like that. But for whatever reason, they never funded it. But I really like exploring these ideas because sometimes they turn out like this probably would have worked. They seem to have done their homework. And then sometimes ideas that seem ridiculous do turn out to be practical. The way that they landed the Curiosity rover on Mars has always been my favorite example of that, where they couldn't use any of the normal landing systems because the rover was too big and heavy, so the parachutes wouldn't slow it down enough, and it was going to bounce off the ground. They couldn't use airbags to absorb the landing. The air was too thin to slow it down. and all the methods they used on more lightweight rovers weren't going to work on the heavier Curiosity. And so they ended up coming up with this idea they couldn't use rockets because if the rockets were too close to the surface, they'd kick up dust, which would hang in the air and confuse the auto-land systems. And it all had to happen automatically. And so they came up with this idea called a sky crane, which was this was back in the early in this decade. But where they had like a separate vehicle that went down with the rover, and then it detached and lowered the rover on a tether while hovering on rockets. And it hovered there, but high up enough that it wouldn't kick up any dust, and lowered the rover down to the surface. And this definitely, like, if you don't know anything about like robotics and space engineering, sounds like a terrible idea. But if you do know about robots, it also sounds like a terrible idea. It doesn't sound any better to like roboticists than it does to civilians or whatever. But no one could find a specific problem with it, just the sort of overall problem. And so, but all of the other ideas that sounded better had some flaw in them that they couldn't get around, and no one could find a problem with the sky crane idea, so they tried it and it worked. And I like these ideas because because at the same time, then there are ideas that seem like they're really great ideas, and then you work through the math and you're like, oh, this has some fatal flaw. And so I really try to stay kind of humble about that kind of thing, about like assuming that I know whether an idea is good or bad in both directions, and just have fun like saying, okay, well, this sounds like a ridiculous question, but well, let's try to answer it. Like if I don't know the answer right away, maybe it's not a ridiculous question. Probably it is. Like you do get a sense of these things, but it's good to be humble. One of my favorite things about doing this research is the discovering like this idea that sounded ridiculous to me is actually really good, or actually like could work, or actually has this idea that seemed good has some fatal flaw. And one of the things that I've done with my most recent book was I got to get in touch with experts who knew about something, and they got to answer my questions and got them to answer questions. I talked to an astrophysicist, some elections experts to write a chapter on how to win an election. And at one point, in one very exciting moment, I got Serena Williams to hit a drone with a tennis ball to see whether or not, to see how accurate tennis balls are for anti-drone, as an anti-drone countermeasure. And the answer is they probably don't work as well as baseballs. But if you have Serena Williams there, definitely let her go with the tennis racket. I had this whole complicated model for how well different sports projectiles would work. The idea was if you're in your backyard and you have a drone flying around and you don't know whose it is, and you want to get rid of it, but you don't have any of these sophisticated anti-drone countermeasures, but you do have sports equipment, which one would work best? And I did kind of a deep dive then into trying to model, like, is it better to throw a baseball or shoot a basketball? Because I feel like I can throw a baseball faster and it's harder, but also it's smaller, which means like I have less margin for error to hitting a target. And also basketballs you can shoot upward more easily. And so I built this whole model based on like different pro sports players' accuracy at launching different kinds of projectiles. And I didn't have a good study for tennis to feed into the model. And so sort of on a whim, I reached out to Serena Williams, who it turned out was like happy to help out. And so I was like, I tried to set up an experiment that would be like minimum effort for her to run, like, oh, if you can stick a target on the wall and hit the ball at the target during practice or something and film it so I can use that to calculate like what's the spread and feed that into the model. But she was like, well, we have a drone. So they flew a drone, she had her husband fly a drone over the tennis court while she tried to shoot it down. And my preliminary model had suggested that it would probably take maybe 5 to 7 serves for a champion tennis player to hit a drone at that range. And she got it on the 3rd try, which I don't know if that's a statistical outlier. Like it might be because I only got three samples there. My guess is it's more of a Serena Williams outlier. But I think my very favorite expert who I've talked to was when I called up the astronaut Chris Hadfield. So I had this chapter I was doing on how to make an emergency landing. And so I reached out to Colonel Hadfield, who was the former commander of the International Space Station, and before that, he was a test pilot who has flown over 100 different aircraft and is like one of the most qualified pilots alive. And again, sort of to my surprise, despite knowing what kind of books I write, he agreed to answer whatever questions I might have about landing. And so we had a phone call where I could talk, a time when I could talk to him for about an hour. And so I wanted to ask about all these weird scenarios you might encounter when flying. And I tried arranging the scenarios from least ridiculous to most ridiculous. And my plan was to start with the least ridiculous and work my way up the list and see how far I could get before he hung up on me. So when I got him on the phone, and the best thing about talking to him was that everything he says comes in that like air traffic control astronaut voice that like sounds completely unruffled by no matter what you're saying, no hesitation, no pause, just everything is like very, it's like, well, this is your captain speaking, we're going to come in at this time, and it's this time here, and the weather is so and so, and there may be a little bit of turbulence, but blah, blah, blah. And it could be like, they could be like describing the plane crashing, but it'll still be in that voice, and you're like, oh, okay, it sounds like they're in control. So I asked him, I got him on the phone, he's, happy to answer my questions, so I'm like, okay. So I started with what I thought was the least ridiculous question, which was, but still kind of ridiculous, which was if you're flying a small plane and you need to come into a land, but you can't find any airfields or even roads or open spaces, the only open areas are farmers' fields, which crop do you steer toward? Do you want to go for something that's like tall and bushy, like corn, that'll be more of sort of padding and drag and cushion your landing, or do you just want something as low to the ground as possible, like strawberries, I guess? And then even though I knew that was my least ridiculous, I was like, sorry, that's kind of a ridiculous question. And he immediately replies, like, well, that's not a ridiculous question at all. I fly small planes, and you think about that stuff all the time. When you're driving into the airfield, you look around, and you think, if I had to come down there, could I? What about over there? Have they brought in their cows this year? How high are their beans right now? And then he started rattling off different crops and what times of year you could land in them. Apparently, corn is okay to land in up until about the middle of June. And so that's when I realized that my plan to try to fluster a test pilot by throwing extreme situations at them without warning might be flawed. But I pressed on and I asked about, like, how would you land on an aircraft carrier in a plane that's not supposed to land on an aircraft carrier? And he immediately says, well, like, I've landed on, these aircraft carriers, and here's the procedure. The first thing you want to do is just get on the radio and get the captain to turn the carrier into the wind and go full steam so that as you're coming in, you can approach where the relative speed of the wind over the deck is as high as possible, which reduces your speed relative to the deck. That'll shorten the distance and hopefully get it short enough for you to stay on the deck. And I had asked about those landing cables. Should you try to snag those with your landing gear? And he said, nope, you got to put those down and land entirely without those. That'll just tear your landing gear off and make you tumble into the ocean. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that sounds very straightforward. Well, and I actually meant to clarify, when I said not supposed to land on an aircraft carrier, what if the captain isn't cooperative? If the captain didn't want you to land, would she turn the carrier, to go downwind or across the wind? And he said, oh no, the captain, she wouldn't do either of those things. She'd just get on the radio and tell if the captain doesn't want you to land on a carrier, they're not going to let you land. What they'll do is they'll get on the intercom, and there are these little vehicles on the deck that they use to tow the planes around. And the captain will get on the intercom and have them drive all those vehicles out into the middle of the landing strip, and within 30 seconds you won't be able to land on that carrier. Now, it is possible you could sneak up on them. People have pulled off some strange things like that, but I can tell you this, the captain wouldn't be too happy. And then what's your plan? You've just landed in the most heavily fortified prison on Earth and declared yourself an inmate. So I worked my way through my list and asked all these questions, and he just kept answering them. Sometimes with, sometimes it would be like, no, you couldn't do that. Sometimes it would be like, oh yeah, people have done that. You see it all the time. I asked about, okay, aircraft carriers are easy. What about landing on a moving train? Could you match speed with a high-speed train and a low-speed plane and then just set yourself down on the roof? And he said, oh yeah, people have done that. Flatbed trucks too, you see that at air shows sometimes. But the thing you want to look out for is that the carriers, that when you touch down, the vehicle's going to be moving up and down a little bit, and it's going to want to bounce you. So you got to touch down and then stay down firmly, or you're going to get jostled off. Next question. But then some things he said were really surprisingly, like I thought, okay, this could work, and he would say, nope, couldn't do that. Like I asked about landing on one of those Olympic ski jumps, and he said, no, I don't think you could do that. And I said, oh, well, there's that sort of curved area at the bottom. Could you maybe come in low and pull up at the right time and sort of slide up the slope right there? And he said, no, the problem is the stands. The stands wrap around the bottom of the slope and they block your optimal approach path. See, before I went into the Air Force, I was a ski instructor up in Canada. And so no matter what I did, I just couldn't stump him. But the best thing about this conversation that I didn't mention this in writing anywhere, but it was that the reason I had an hour to talk to him was that this conversation was happening while he was on a layover between two flights. So his end of this conversation was on a cell phone in the Toronto Pearson International Airport, somewhere in the gate area, which I realized when I started coming up on the time, and I just kept throwing scenarios at him one after another. Like, what if you get locked in the cockpit, you get your sleeve closed in the cockpit door, so you can't reach the controls, but you can throw dinner rolls from the in-flight meals with extreme accuracy? And he would say, well, you could do that in the following plane models where the controls are set up such that you could hit them. I asked him, what if you get locked on the outside of the plane? What if you need to, which part would you crawl toward if you could crawl around in the fuselage to try to steer the plane by hand? And he says, definitely, you need to work your way back to the tail. That's the only place you could get the full control you need. And then he started laying out like what you stand on and where you'd put one hand on, which part of the fin, which parts you could move by hand, which parts you couldn't. So I start realizing that like not only is he not hanging up on me, like we're running out of time there. And so I start giving him openings, saying like, hey, look, I know your flight has to leave, so I really appreciate it. If I have follow-up questions, I can email you. And he would say, oh, no, it's okay. They haven't called my group number yet. We can keep going. And then at some point, he keeps answering, and then at some point they do call his group number. And I know this because he says, hold on a minute, I gotta go for a minute. And I was like, oh, well, it was great talking to you, thank you so much, I'll email you later, no problem. And he said, no, hold on, they just gotta scan my boarding pass, I'll be right back. And then I listened over the phone as they scanned his boarding pass, and then he picked the phone back up and resumed talking to me as he walked down the jetway with the other passengers and boarded the plane and made his way down the aisle to his seat. And all I could think was, those poor passengers. Because there he goes, walking down the aisle. Well, if I were trapped on the outside of the plane, I think that what I'd try to do is get back to the tail. Like the most captain astronaut-looking person on the planet. And so at that point, I basically hung up on him. So if there was anyone on that flight from Toronto Pearson International Airport on that particular day, I do apologize for any upset that caused. But anyone who was on that plane, man, it may have been a little bit alarming to overhear, but there is no plane that was safer than that one. So I know we're running short on time here, but I think we do have time for a little bit of questions if anyone wants to ask anything. And I think we've got, what's the mic situation now?
So we have two runners here, so if you guys want to raise your hands, we'll try to pass the microphones to you for questions. And I see we have a couple here, and I will just forestall my particular question that I went back to the events team. Our ball pit has 90,000 balls in it.
Hi, back here.
Oh, yeah.
Big fan of yours. I'm curious, with all of your research, where do you usually start? Like Googling ball pits or whatever it is you're looking up? Where does the process begin?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time I'll have a question. To me, the most compelling kind of question is one where I'm like, I don't know the answer to this, but I think I know how you could figure it out. You just need this piece of information and this, and maybe you could put those together, like maybe that would work. And so I'll go out seeking where I can get those individual things. So a lot of the time I'll do like, the Google Scholar, Internet Archive searches, general Google searches, go to Wikipedia, look at a whole bunch of citations on a topic and try to find good papers on it. But, like the regular research stuff. What I think is really fun though is sometimes digging into weird Cold War era studies on something. But what I think is really fun is a lot of the time the thing I'm studying, like trying to research, isn't covered in a lot of literature, but there are answers out there. It's just no one has needed to answer the specific version of the question I'm asking. So I was trying to answer a question about whether if you collect a whole bunch of pollen in one giant heap, how flammable is it? And I read a whole bunch of botany papers on pollen and its various properties and how it interacts with fire. But none of them were really addressing the question of pollen in bulk and how flammable that is, how easily that will ignite when exposed to a flame. And maybe I could have found that if I had kept reading, because I kept finding a bunch of things that were tangentially connected to it. And then I realized that because they clearly had the information, they just hadn't bothered to put that specific answer into their papers. And then I realized, wait a minute, I just spent an hour reading botany papers on pollen. There is a much easier way to answer this, which is I just opened up YouTube and typed pollen flammable. And it turns out the world's teenagers have answered this question for me, because there are a whole bunch of videos of people wow, look at all the pollen that we just swept off our car. I'm going to light a match and drop it in, whoosh, oh my God, everything's on fire. My yard is on fire now. So what I like when you can find an answer to something in a weird place. One of my favorite, I got to cite a couple of really weird sources in my most recent book, there was one that was a 400-page book, Cheese Rheology and Texture, which is the handbook. I assume it is the definitive work on the mechanical properties of different types of cheese. I also got to cite a student paper, which was not published anywhere, which was an awkward, just MLA-type citation situation, because I just found this paper on a college website. It was the only people, it was these two students who had worked out the answer to a question, and they were, as far as I could tell, the only people who had figured out the shape of a particular type of gear. But they didn't publish it. This was just an assignment they turned in, and it was on the website for the university, it looked like by accident. It was from 2011, but it was just in tilde professor name / class / year / student name -48.pdf or whatever. And so I'm but this has the answer now. Now I know it. What do I do? But it doesn't feel right to cite a paper that I basically found in a dumpster. And so with the help of my publisher, we actually tracked down the students who wrote the paper, and the lead author, or else, I don't know, I don't think they really count lead authors, but the one who we were able to find is now a math professor in Australia, and was happy to have, had totally forgotten the project, but was happy to have her work cited. So I really like the weird corners that these, the rabbit holes that I get led down. Let's see.
No. Unless I missed it, you never released the survey results from 3 years ago or something. You did a survey as part of your comic, a Google form with a whole bunch of different questions. Did you do anything with that? Do you plan to do anything with that? And do you release it?
No. So I put up a survey where I thought it would be fun to just look for weird correlations between answers that people give. And I posted this using Google Forms. And I just asked a whole bunch of questions, do you eat condiments out of the fridge as a snack? Have you ever walked on stilts? Has there been a thunderstorm recently where you live? What type of monitor are you looking at? And just asking every kind of random thing, data point, that might be interesting to explore, name 3 movie stars, etc. And unfortunately, this went a little bit wrong because I think it was actually the day that Google Forms was launching a new internal architecture, and 500,000 people tried to respond to this immediately, and I got frantic emails and then calls from the people who run Google Forms saying we can't actually load balance correctly for this. And it may have just been the biggest single day load they've ever had. And so, because there were lots of open, unlimited text input fields just for fun. And I was very careful. I limited the ones I wanted to limit. And then there were a few where I'm I'm going to let people put as much as they want here. but they ended up having to like create a whole bunch of duplicate forms so they could put each one on a different instance of whatever underlying architecture they had. So we actually like lost some of the data. Most of it we got, but they had to like go through and assemble it over the following weeks, and get it to me like not through the regular download interface. And the main thing so then by the time I got it, I was like, had another project I was in the middle of and couldn't immediately work on it. But what I did find when I dipped into this data was that it was way easier to make, like I was trying to pick questions that wouldn't lead to correlations that would support actual legitimate, like bad social science. And it was really easy, though, to pick out things and be like, oh, this seems like it's a proxy variable for this. And like, oh, this is people who live in this country do things this way, And it felt like something that I didn't want to be careless with, and also didn't want to like publish a bunch of data that, it's like 500,000 responses that I have to, things that I have to go through and like make sure I'm not revealing people's personal data, And really, though, I felt like I had asked people to answer this survey without saying what it was for, just saying like, you can trust me, I'm going to do good things with this. And looking over it, it was like really interesting data, but too easy to kind of do shoddy social science with, and too easy to just like draw conclusions about people that like I didn't feel like I didn't want to put up something like that using this real data that people had trusted me with to like insult them for eating condiments out of the fridge or whatever. And I really like there was some interesting stuff in there, but I didn't want to. But like the most interesting stuff was the stuff that was the most like real social science, and I didn't want to do anything with that I wasn't comfortable with, And so I've basically erred on the side of not publishing something using it unless it's something that I'm really confident is like, this is a good thing to do with this data. Honestly, I wasn't expecting 500,000 people to fill it out. It's just a giant mess of like doing anything with, but if anyone knows a good platform for visualizing large amounts of data. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I know we're short on time.
Hi. I thank you for coming. I credit you for both why I learned to write Python and also how I finally gave up correcting people on the internet. My question for you is, how does one develop a sense of persistence? Habit of persistence?
I don't know. For me, I think a lot of the time it's like I'm constantly oscillating between like sticking with something and going way too deep into it, and like also immediately saying like, this is really hard. Is there another way I could go do this? But part of what I like about weird questions is that answering a ridiculous, like when I hear a question that I think I know how to answer, it feels like getting a song stuck in my head where like I can't think about anything else until I figure out whether I'm right about this or not. And so I really like tackling questions that sound ridiculous but that I don't know the answer to. And for me, that's what drags me through all the work is like, I want to know the answer to this question. I want to know if my initial guess was right or not, and I think this tool will get me to it if I just figure out how to get, all of the fiddly details to work. I've always tried to like one thing that's really come across for me with doing both a physics degree and also answering people's weird questions is that sense of humility, and like not assuming that you know things. So like, and not being embarrassed to admit that you don't know stuff. There was a time when I was a kid, when I was a teenager and I was applying to colleges, my mom used a word that I didn't know, and I was like, oh, what does that word mean? And she looked at me kind of funny and was like, wait, you just did the SATs and and you're applying to colleges, but you don't know that so-and-so word? And I was like, yeah. And then she, explained what it meant and moved on. Then like 6 hours later, she took me aside and was like, hey, I just wanted to apologize to you. Because like yesterday or like last night or whatever, I kind of made fun of you for not knowing a word, and I try to never do that. And this was like so weird to me. Like I had basically forgotten it, but like, and this, she hadn't done this kind of thing usually, but she was like, I think it's really important not to make fun of people for admitting that they don't know something, especially for admitting that they don't know a word. And I try to never do that, and I want to let you know I'm sorry I slipped up. And that really stuck with me. And so at some point eventually I did a comic about this when I noticed people were making fun of someone on the internet for being like, how do you not know X, or how did you whatever? Like, everyone knows this. And it occurred to me that like when there's something that everyone knows, I was thinking like, well, wait, everyone starts off not knowing it. And like, yeah, everyone who is my age or in my particular area like knows this. Maybe everyone, if there's a fact that like every adult knows, then that means that if everyone starts off not knowing it, just based on like the population of the US and how many new people there are, at every year, that means that every day, for a fact that everyone knows, there are approximately 10,000 people who are learning that fact for the first time. And there's no way around that. You can't say like, well, people should be more educated. And it's like, well, you could tell them they need to learn it earlier, but they're going to have to learn it somewhere. And so I did a comic about this where I said that if when someone admits that they don't know something, try not to make fun of them about it, because all you're going to do is you're not going to teach them like you should work harder at knowing more things. Like you're going to have the 10,000 a day learning it. All you do is you train them not to reveal to you when they're having that moment when they're learning something. And then you miss out on the fun. You make everyone be more reticent to admit things and ask questions and stuff, but also you miss out on getting to be there when they're learning something. And so I did a comic encouraging people that like when someone says like, if you refer to the Diet Coke and Mentos thing, and someone's like, what Diet Coke and Mentos thing? Instead of being like, how do you not know about the Diet Coke and Mentos thing? It was all over the internet when I was in college or whatever. You've got someone there who doesn't know about the Diet Coke and Mentos thing. This is a golden opportunity. You can be like, hey, let's go to the grocery store. Because boy, are you in for a surprise. Because you are one of today's lucky 10,000. And so, thank you so much for having me here. I've really enjoyed this, and I've had so much fun researching weird stuff to answer your weird questions and trying to share what I've learned. And I've enjoyed, learning all this stuff, and hopefully you have, maybe learned something cool through that. And if so, then you are one of today's lucky 10,000. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Randall.
Thank you.